Imagine a city clinging to a mountainside so high above the rest of the world that the air itself feels like a different substance, thin and cold and unforgiving, pressing against every breath you take, with a kind of quiet insistence that your body was never quite designed for this altitude. A place where the sun burns through the atmosphere with unusual ferocity because there is simply less air between you and it. Where snow and ice persist year-round even as miners swing picks and haul ore in the shadow of glaciers that have watched over these slopes for thousands of years. Where gold runs through the rock beneath your feet and through the entire economy of a settlement that has grown up around its extraction in conditions that would stop most people from even considering it as a place to live, let alone a place to raise a family, build a life, and call home. This is La Rinconada, Peru, a mining city perched on the slopes of a glacier in the Andes Mountains, at an elevation of approximately 5,100 meters above sea level, making it, by every credible measurement, the highest permanently inhabited city on the face of the earth. And before we go any further into its story, if places that exist right at the edge of what seems humanly possible genuinely fascinate you, subscribe right now, because today we are walking through exactly how life actually works for the tens of thousands of people who have chosen to make this extraordinary, brutal, and endlessly compelling place their home. Turn on notifications as well, because we have many more journeys like this one waiting, and you will not want to miss where we head next. La Rinconada sits in the Puno region of southeastern Peru, in the Andes mountain range, at an altitude so extreme that simply comparing it to other high places fails to fully convey what the number means in practical human terms. The city of Cusco, itself famous for being high enough to leave sea-level visitors breathless and lightheaded upon arrival, sits at approximately 3,400 meters above sea level, and that elevation alone is enough to make most visitors take the altitude seriously for the first several days. La Rinconada sits nearly 1,700 meters higher than that. Machu Picchu, arguably the most famous archaeological site in all of South America, and a place renowned for its dramatic mountain setting, rises to roughly 2,400 meters, meaning that La Rinconada towers more than 2.5 kilometers above even that celebrated peak. The air at La Rinconada contains approximately 50% of the oxygen found at sea level, a reduction significant enough to have real, measurable physiological consequences for every person who lives there, every day, without exception, for as long as they remain. The approach to La Rinconada is itself an experience that communicates something essential about the character of the place before a single step is taken inside the city limits. The road rising toward the settlement climbs through a landscape of truly extraordinary scale, winding upward past the turquoise and blue waters of Lake Titicaca far below. Through stretches of high-altitude grassland called puna, past traditional Andean villages where llamas and alpacas graze across slopes too steep and rocky for most agricultural purposes, and eventually into a zone where the vegetation thins dramatically, then disappears almost entirely, replaced by snow, ice, bare rock, and the particular cold clarity of high mountain light. Along the road and approaching the city, trucks loaded with ore, with supplies, with the basic materials of daily life, all lumber upward in a steady procession that has been grinding this route for decades, carrying the economic lifeblood of a settlement that depends almost entirely on a single, relentless, physically punishing industry. The glacier called Bella Durmiente, which translates to Sleeping Beauty in English, rises immediately above the city, its name derived from the outline it traces against the sky, which local tradition has long described as resembling a sleeping figure when viewed from below. This glacier is not simply a dramatic backdrop to the settlement. It is woven into the very foundation of how the city came to exist here and why it continues to exist here still, because it is the glacial rock underneath and around it that contains the gold deposits that have drawn wave after wave of hopeful miners to these slopes, and it is the glacier's meltwater that flows down through the settlement, providing fresh water while simultaneously carrying with it some of the pollutants and environmental consequences generated by decades of intensive mining activity directly above. Gold has been known to exist in these mountains for centuries, with records of mining activity in the high Andes stretching back through the colonial period and into pre-Columbian times, when the Inca Empire recognized the value of the metals embedded in these extreme elevation landscapes and organized labor to extract them. But the settlement that exists today at La Rinconada is largely a product of more recent decades, growing dramatically through successive waves of migration tied to periods when rising global gold prices made the brutal physical and logistical challenges of operating a mine at 5,000 meters above sea level economically worthwhile for enough people to sustain a genuine urban settlement rather than simply a temporary camp. The growth of La Rinconada has been particularly dramatic over the past several decades, accelerating significantly in the early 21st century as gold prices climbed to historic highs on global markets. Estimates of the population vary considerably, partly because the settlement lacks the kind of formal administrative infrastructure that would make precise counting straightforward, and partly because the population itself fluctuates as workers arrive in large numbers when conditions seem favorable and depart again when they deteriorate. Conservative estimates suggest a population somewhere in the range of 30 to 40,000 people, while some estimates run higher, with the broader region sometimes counted reaching toward 50,000 or beyond during peak periods of mining activity. What is not in question is that this represents a genuinely large human settlement operating under conditions that by almost any objective measure qualify as extreme. The physical environment of La Rinconada imposes itself on daily life in ways that someone living at lower elevation would find extraordinary. Altitude sickness, known in Spanish as soroche and in its more severe forms as something that can genuinely kill, is an omnipresent reality for anyone arriving in the city without the physiological adaptations that come from generations of high-altitude living. Long-term residents, many of whom have Andean indigenous heritage and carry specific genetic adaptations enabling their bodies to extract oxygen more efficiently from thin air, cope with the altitude in ways that newcomers simply cannot replicate without extended time for acclimatization. For recent arrivals from lower regions, headaches, nausea, fatigue so profound it makes basic movement difficult, disrupted sleep, and in more serious cases, pulmonary or cerebral edema represent real risks that must be managed carefully. The cold at this altitude is relentless and penetrating in a way that is qualitatively different from the cold experienced in even quite chilly lower elevation environments. Temperatures at La Rinconada regularly drop well below freezing overnight, and even during daylight hours the cold maintains a grip that makes staying warm a constant practical priority. At the same time, the thin atmosphere that makes breathing difficult also means that the sun's ultraviolet radiation arrives with unusual intensity, creating the paradoxical situation where residents must simultaneously protect themselves from intense sun exposure while managing severe cold, a combination that shapes clothing choices, housing design, and daily routines in ways specific to this extreme high-altitude environment. The housing of La Rinconada reflects the reality of a settlement that grew quickly, largely informally, and without the benefit of significant centralized planning or infrastructure investment. Most structures in the city are built from corrugated metal sheeting, basic bricks, and salvage construction materials, assembled in ways that prioritize basic shelter from the cold and elements over aesthetics or long-term structural durability. Because the settlement sits on glacial terrain, with underlying permafrost and ice in many areas, conventional construction techniques face significant complications, and buildings sit on terrain that can shift, settle, and prove unstable in ways that create ongoing structural challenges for many properties. Rows of buildings climb up the mountain slopes in dense, irregular patterns, their corrugated metal roofs weathered and often weighed down by rocks placed to prevent them from being torn away by the fierce winds that sweep across these high slopes with considerable regularity. Inside these homes, families work hard to maintain temperatures that make daily life possible. Kerosene heaters and small electric heaters provide warmth where electricity connections exist, while basic cooking on small stoves serves the dual purpose of preparing food and generating some additional warmth within confined living spaces. Insulation in many dwellings is minimal at best, meaning that the cold outside is never entirely kept at bay, and that heating fuel represents a genuinely significant ongoing household expense for many families at a place where the bitter cold never truly relents, and where simply keeping a living space warm enough for comfortable habitation requires constant effort and resources. Water access has historically represented one of the most significant practical challenges facing residents of La Rinconada, and while the situation has improved somewhat through infrastructure development in recent years, it remains complicated by the interaction between the settlement's water sources and the intensive mining activity taking place immediately above and around it. The glacier above the city provides meltwater that flows down through the settlement, and some residents rely on this meltwater as their primary water source. However, mining operations on the glacier and surrounding rock involve the use of mercury and other chemical compounds in the gold extraction process, and these substances contaminate water sources, creating genuine public health concerns that have been documented by researchers studying the environmental conditions in and around the settlement. Delivered water, sold by trucks making their way up the mountain road, provides an alternative source for those who can afford it, while some areas of the settlement have gradually gained access to piped water infrastructure, though coverage remains incomplete. Mercury deserves particular attention in any serious discussion of life at La Rinconada, because its presence in the environment and in the bodies of the people who live and work there represents one of the most serious public health dimensions of this remarkable city. Mercury is used in artisanal gold mining as an amalgamation agent, meaning it is mixed with crushed ore to bind to the gold particles within it, forming an amalgam that can then be heated to drive off the mercury and leave relatively pure gold behind. This process is effective and cheap enough to be widely used in small-scale mining operations around the world, but it comes with severe environmental and health consequences, because the mercury that evaporates during the heating process and the mercury that washes away from mining sites into waterways does not simply disappear. It enters the environment, it enters the food chain through fish and other organisms living downstream, and it accumulates in the bodies of people who are regularly exposed to it through breathing contaminated air, drinking contaminated water, or consuming contaminated fish. Studies conducted in La Rinconada and the surrounding region have found elevated mercury levels in the blood and hair of residents, including children and women of reproductive age, at levels that public health researchers consider concerning given mercury's well-documented toxicity to the human nervous system, particularly for developing children and fetuses. The scale of small-scale artisanal mining across the region means that mercury contamination is not limited to the immediate area of any single mine, but spreads through water systems, affecting communities downstream from the mining operations as well. This is a dimension of life in La Rinconada that sits somewhat uncomfortably alongside the economic narrative of opportunity in gold, because the same mining activity that makes life in this extreme city economically viable is simultaneously creating health burdens for the people who live there that will carry consequences extending well beyond any individual mining season. The economic structure of La Rinconada rests almost entirely on gold mining, and specifically on the particular form of artisanal and small-scale gold mining that has characterized the region for decades. The mining takes place through a combination of larger informal mining operations and the individual or small group prospecting activity of the many independent miners who have come to the city hoping to find their fortune in the gold-bearing rock beneath the glacier. The relationship between different levels and types of mining activity at La Rinconada is complex and often informal, reflecting the broader reality that the entire settlement operates largely outside the formal regulatory and legal frameworks that govern mining in much of the rest of Peru. One of the most distinctive and, from any outside perspective, one of the most immediately striking aspects of how the mining economy in La Rinconada actually functions is the traditional labor arrangement known locally as cachorreo, a system that operates as the primary compensation mechanism for a large portion of the workforce at the mines. Under cachorreo, miners work for a mining operator for a period of approximately 30 days without receiving any monetary wage whatsoever for their labor during that time. At the end of this period, they are given a set amount of time, typically a few hours, to take whatever ore they can physically carry from the mine with their own hands and their own body. Whatever gold they can extract from this ore using their own means becomes their compensation for the entire month of unpaid work. This system, which has roots in colonial-era labor arrangements and has persisted through subsequent generations in the high Andes mining economy, creates an economic reality of enormous uncertainty and risk for the individual miner. If the ore they carry out proves rich in gold, the month's work may yield meaningful income. If the ore proves poor, or if their access to the richest ore during their allotted window of time is limited by circumstance, competition, or simple bad luck, the same month of grueling physical labor at altitude may yield almost nothing. It is in effect a system that transfers virtually all the financial risk of mining operations onto the individual worker, while allowing the mine operator to maintain a workforce without the financial commitment of a regular wage bill, regardless of how production or gold prices fluctuate from week to week or month to month. Yet despite the obvious vulnerabilities this system creates for workers, it also contains within it the fundamental premise that attracts so many people to La Rinconada in the first place, the possibility, however statistically unlikely for any individual, that on a given cachareo day, the ore carried out will contain a significant gold deposit, a genuinely lucky strike that could change a family's financial situation dramatically in a single afternoon. This possibility, the chance at a windfall that the formal wage economy simply cannot provide, represents the core economic logic drawing migrants from lower elevations and from across Peru and beyond to endure the cold, the altitude, the health risks, and the difficult living conditions that characterize daily life in this extraordinary settlement. It is the same logic that has driven gold rush communities throughout human history, and La Rinconada is, in many respects, a gold rush city still in progress, still drawing people with the promise that the mountain might yield its treasure to them specifically, today, on this particular cachareo afternoon. The workforce at La Rinconada is overwhelmingly male, reflecting the gendered character of underground mining work specifically, though the city's population includes a significant number of women and families as well, particularly among those who have established longer-term residency rather than simply arriving as temporary workers. Women in La Rinconada work in several capacities that are essential to the functioning of the settlement, among the most visible being the payaqueras, women who work in the mining waste piles and tailings left behind after ore has been processed, searching through the discarded rock for gold-bearing fragments that the primary processing missed or considered too marginal to pursue. This work is physically demanding, carried out in the open at extreme altitude, exposed to the cold, and to contaminated dust and waste materials. But it provides a means of independent economic activity for women who have followed husbands or partners to the city, or who have come on their own initiative seeking income in a place where the formal economy offers very limited alternative opportunities. The payaqueras are not simply a marginal economic feature of the settlement. They represent a distinct and historically significant category of labor within Andean mining culture. Women whose work in the waste piles has supported families and communities across different mining towns in the region for generations. In La Rinconada, they can be seen on any given day working across the tailings areas of the mines, often wearing the characteristic brightly colored polara skirts common across the Andean highlands, alongside protective work gear, sifting through waste rock with practiced efficiency, born of long experience at reading which fragments might carry gold and which are purely waste material. The income they earn from this activity varies, like that of the male miners themselves, with the quality of the waste they have access to, but it can meaningfully supplement household income and in some cases provide primary financial support for families whose male miners are between productive periods. Commerce in La Rinconada takes the form of a dense, concentrated market and commercial zone within the settlement, where goods of every description are bought and sold by vendors who have themselves recognized that supplying a population of tens of thousands living in one of the most logistically challenging locations on Earth represents a viable business opportunity in its own right. Covered in open-air market stalls sell food, clothing, tools, electronics, alcohol, building materials, and essentially every category of consumer good that a population at this altitude requires. Restaurants, small eating establishments, and food stalls serve the population throughout the day and well into the evening hours, providing hot meals that represent not just sustenance, but one of the primary sources of warmth and comfort available to miners returning from shifts in the cold underground. Food in La Rinconada reflects both the practical constraints of supplying a high-altitude city far from agricultural production areas and the cultural heritage of the predominantly Andean population that makes up a significant portion of the settlement's residents. Staples of the Andean diet appear throughout the market and in the cooking of local restaurants, including the remarkable diversity of potato varieties native to this region of the world, which is after all the original homeland of the potato as a cultivated crop, along with quinoa, dried and freeze-dried foods that have been preservation methods in the high Andes for thousands of years, and various forms of preserved meat including charqui, the dried meat that provides high-protein sustenance well-suited to the caloric demands of physical labor at altitude, canned goods, packaged foods, and products transported up the mountain road from lower elevation cities supplement these traditional staples, at prices that reflect the logistical costs of getting them to an elevation where the road itself is a significant obstacle to supply. Alcohol occupies a complex and troubling place in the social fabric of La Rinconada, acknowledged openly by residents, community organizations, and public health observers as one of the more significant social challenges facing the settlement. Chicha, the traditional fermented corn beer with deep roots across Andean culture, alongside commercially produced beer, distilled spirits, and various other alcoholic beverages, are widely available and widely consumed throughout the city, particularly among the male mining workforce. Various factors intersect to make alcohol consumption a particularly significant issue in this specific environment, including the isolated and highly masculine social world of underground mining, the fundamental uncertainty and stress of an economic system like Cacareo that delivers either windfall or nothing, with very little in between, the absence of many of the social and family structures that might moderate consumption in a more stable community setting, and the simple reality that in a cold, dark, physically punishing environment, alcohol provides a temporary warmth and numbness that has significant appeal regardless of its other consequences. The consequences manifest in elevated rates of domestic violence, in public disorder, in health complications that add to an already challenging health environment, and in the economic waste of hard-won mining income, flowing rapidly into alcohol consumption, rather than towards savings or family support. Community organizations and local leaders have worked to address excessive alcohol consumption through various awareness and intervention efforts, but it remains a stubborn challenge in a settlement where so many of the structural conditions that tend to enable high alcohol consumption are deeply embedded in the basic economic and social organization of the place. Healthcare in La Rinconada represents one of the most pressing practical challenges facing residents, given the combination of an extreme physical environment, significant environmental contamination, the health risks associated with underground mining work, and the very limited medical infrastructure available within the settlement itself. A health post operates in the city, providing basic medical services to the population, but the facility's capacity is limited relative to the population it serves and to the complexity of health problems that arise in this environment. For more serious conditions, patients must be transported down the mountain road to the nearest city, with more complete medical facilities, a journey that itself presents challenges in emergency situations, given the road conditions and the time required to descend to a meaningful elevation. The specific health profile of La Rinconada's population reflects its environment in ways that are quite different from what might be seen in a typical urban population at lower elevation. Chronic mountain sickness, known as Monge disease after the Peruvian physiologist who first described it systematically, represents a condition specific to people who live at high altitude for extended periods, in which the body's initial adaptation to thin air, producing more red blood cells to carry more oxygen, overshoots to a pathological degree, causing blood to become abnormally thick and creating serious cardiovascular complications. Respiratory conditions associated with dust inhalation in the mines, including various forms of pneumoconiosis and silicosis, resulting from breathing rock dust over years of underground work, represent another significant occupational health burden carried by the mining workforce. Lead and mercury exposure create neurological and developmental health risks, while basic infectious diseases circulate through a densely settled population with limited access to sanitation infrastructure, creating a public health environment of genuine complexity and concern. Sanitation infrastructure in La Rinconada has historically been extremely limited, a significant public health issue for a settlement of this population density. Open disposal of waste in parts of the settlement, combined with the contamination of water sources described earlier, creates conditions that facilitate the transmission of waterborne and foodborne illness. Efforts to improve sanitation infrastructure have made some progress over the years, driven partly by Peruvian government programs, and partly by the recognition within the community that inadequate sanitation creates health costs that affect productivity and quality of life for the entire population. But improving infrastructure in a settlement built on difficult glacial terrain, largely informally and without comprehensive planning, presents significant practical challenges that mean progress has been slower and more incomplete than many residents would prefer. Education in La Rinconada has expanded considerably over the years since the settlement first began growing, with schools now serving the children of residents across different age levels. The presence of children in schools is itself meaningful for understanding what La Rinconada has become, because it signals a shift, for at least a significant portion of the population, from treating the place as a temporary sojourn in search of mining income to be sent back home toward lower elevation communities, toward something more like genuine settled community life with the full social infrastructure that implies. Teachers working in La Rinconada face the challenge of educating children in an environment of significant social instability, where families arrive and depart with considerable frequency following the rhythms of mining fortune and misfortune, and where the poverty, health burdens, and difficult living conditions of many students' home lives create real barriers to educational engagement and achievement. The children growing up in La Rinconada inhabit a world that is in almost every observable way unlike the childhood experienced by children at lower elevation in Peru, let alone the childhoods depicted in the consumer media that reaches even this extreme altitude city through satellite television and mobile phones. Playing at 5,000 meters of altitude means play that is shaped by cold, by terrain of ice and rock rather than grass and soil, by streets and spaces that are not designed or maintained with children's use in mind, and by the constant background presence of the mining industry that underpins the entire settlement's existence. Studies of children growing up at extreme altitude have found measurable differences in physical development compared to children raised at lower elevations, reflecting the body's ongoing adaptations to reduced oxygen availability, even for children born into families with generations of high-altitude heritage behind them. Mobile phone connectivity and internet access have reached La Rinconada to a degree that represents one of the more striking contrasts between the ancient harshness of the physical environment and the connectivity of the contemporary world. Satellite and cellular infrastructure serving the broader region has made it possible for residents to maintain contact with family members in distant cities and provinces, to access social media, to stream entertainment, and to engage with the wider world in ways that would have been completely impossible for earlier generations of miners working these same slopes. This connectivity matters not just for entertainment and social connection, but practically, because it allows residents to monitor gold price movements on global markets, to communicate with potential buyers for their gold output, and to access information relevant to health, safety, and their legal rights as workers in ways that improve their position relative to what was available to earlier generations. The informal and largely unregulated character of mining at La Rinconada has significant implications for the legal and political framework within which residents live their daily lives. The settlement operates largely outside the formal systems that govern most aspects of life in a more typical Peruvian city. Land tenure is informal, with most structures built without formal permits or legal land titles, creating a situation where residents' security of occupation depends on informal community norms and relationships rather than on legally enforceable property rights. The mining activity itself, while not entirely ungoverned, operates in a complex space where formal mining concessions, informal arrangements, and the practical reality of tens of thousands of people pursuing gold in the same mountain create a regulatory situation that the Peruvian state has found difficult to fully formalize or enforce consistently. This informality has consequences that cut in multiple directions. On one hand, it has allowed the settlement to grow quickly and flexibly in response to economic opportunity, without the delays and constraints that formal development processes would have imposed. On the other hand, it means that residents have limited access to the formal protections, services, and infrastructure investments that formal legal and administrative status would theoretically bring. It means that environmental regulation of mining practices, including the mercury use that creates documented health risks for the population, is difficult to enforce. And it means that disputes over mining territory, earnings, and resources are often resolved through informal means that can range from negotiation to outright conflict, rather than through formal legal processes. Crime and security present significant challenges in La Rinconada, driven by the combination of large amounts of gold changing hands in an environment with limited formal law enforcement presence relative to population, high rates of alcohol consumption, the social stresses inherent in a transient population pursuing an economic activity defined by enormous variability in individual outcomes, and the general difficulty of maintaining order in a settlement where formal institutional authority has historically been weak. Robbery of miners returning from Cacareo with gold, disputes between competing claims over mining territory, and various forms of interpersonal violence associated with alcohol represent recurring security concerns that the community and what formal security presence exists there must constantly navigate. Gold dealers operating in La Rinconada and in the regional cities below represent the crucial commercial link between the labor of the mines and the global gold market, purchasing the gold extracted by individual miners and small operations and aggregating it into quantities suitable for sale to larger buyers, refiners, and eventually into the international supply chain for gold that ends up in electronics, jewelry, financial instruments, and countless other applications around the world. The price that individual miners receive from local dealers reflects the global gold price, but filtered through a series of intermediaries who each take their margin, meaning that the people performing the most physically demanding and health-risking work at the base of the supply chain tend to receive a fraction of what the metal is ultimately worth on world markets. This gap between the value of what comes out of the mountain and what reaches the hands of the people who extracted it represents one of the fundamental economic inequities built into the structure of artisanal and small-scale mining economics globally, and La Rinconada presents it in a particularly vivid and extreme form. The Peruvian government's relationship with La Rinconada has evolved over the years, moving from a period of relative neglect or indifference toward a more engaged, if still incomplete, effort to bring some formal services and regulatory presence to the settlement. Investments in road improvement, health facilities, school construction, and sanitation infrastructure reflect a recognition that a settlement of tens of thousands of Peruvian citizens, however informally established, cannot simply be left entirely to its own devices. Efforts to formalize the mining activity through licensing and registration programs have attempted to bring more operators within a regulatory framework that would theoretically allow better environmental oversight and better worker protection, though the complexity and informality of the existing arrangements make this a slow and incomplete process. Political representation for La Rinconada has grown as well, with the settlement's population now large enough to matter meaningfully in regional elections, giving residents a degree of political leverage that has motivated candidates at various levels to engage more seriously with the specific issues facing the community. This growing political voice has helped drive some of the infrastructure investments that have made incremental improvements to conditions in the city, though residents and advocates consistently argue that the scale and pace of improvement remains inadequate relative to the genuine needs of a population living in conditions of extreme environmental challenge, combined with significant poverty and limited formal support. Migration to La Rinconada continues to flow from across Peru and from neighboring countries, drawn by the fundamental promise that has always defined this place, that somewhere in the rock beneath the glacier there is gold, and that a person willing to endure the cold and the altitude and the uncertainty of the Cachorreo system might be the one who finds it in sufficient quantity to change their life. The migrants who arrive come from many different backgrounds, many from the broader Puno region of Peru and from other highland areas of the country, bringing with them Andean cultural practices, Quechua and Aymara language alongside Spanish, and the kind of physical adaptation to high-altitude living that generations of Andean ancestry provides. Others come from lowland areas of Peru, motivated by the mining boom but arriving without the same physiological advantages, facing a harder acclimatization process and a more challenging initial period as their bodies struggle to adjust to the demands of working underground in reduced oxygen conditions. Women who migrate to La Rinconada do so through a variety of different pathways and with a variety of different motivations. Some follow partners or spouses who went ahead to establish themselves in the mining economy, joining them once some basic foothold had been secured in the settlement. Others arrive independently, seeing opportunity in the commerce and services economy that supports the mining workforce, setting up small businesses, market stalls, food service operations, and various other enterprises that can provide income without requiring the same direct physical access to the mines that the Cachorreo system provides to male workers. Still others come as palaqueras, having heard of the possibility of working the tailings piles and making some income from the discarded ore, a pathway that requires little capital to enter and provides at least the possibility of meaningful return for sustained physical effort. Community and social organization within La Rinconada takes forms that reflect both the particular circumstances of this unusual settlement and the broader cultural heritage of the predominantly Andean population. The concept of Aini, the Andean principle of reciprocal exchange and mutual support within a community, continues to influence how neighbors and community members relate to each other, with informal networks of mutual assistance providing some of the social safety net that formal institutions are not yet fully equipped to provide in this environment. These informal networks matter enormously in a place where illness, injury, or a run of bad cachorreo luck can leave a family without income in a matter of weeks, and where formal welfare systems are distant and difficult to access. Festivals and celebrations maintain an important place in the social and cultural calendar of La Rinconada's residents, providing moments of collective joy and community solidarity that offer genuine relief from the grinding difficulty of daily life at altitude. Peruvian national holidays, Catholic religious celebrations blended with Andean spiritual traditions in the syncretic manner characteristic of highland Andean culture throughout Peru, and local celebrations specific to the mining community all punctuate the year with moments of gathering, music, dance, and shared festivity. Carnivals, with the distinctive music, dance, and costume traditions of the Puno region from which so many residents hail, bring color and communal energy to a settlement that in its everyday working character tends toward the grim and utilitarian. The spiritual life of La Rinconada's residents reflects the same deep synthesis of Catholic and Andean indigenous spiritual traditions found throughout the highland Andes of Peru. The Pachamama, or Earth Mother, central to Andean cosmology and deeply embedded in the spiritual worldview of peoples across the Andes for millennia before the arrival of Christianity, remains a genuinely significant spiritual presence for many miners and their families. Ritual offerings to Pachamama, asking permission and protection for the extraction of minerals from the earth, represent practices observed by many miners before entering the underground workings, reflecting a deeply held sense that the mountain itself is a living, spiritual entity that must be respected and propitiated, rather than simply exploited without acknowledgement. The tío, literally meaning uncle in Spanish, but carrying the specific meaning of the spirit believed to dwell within the mine and govern the availability of ore, is another spiritual figure central to the religious practice of Andean miners throughout Peru and Bolivia. Figures representing the tío, typically depicted with exaggerated features, horns, and surrounded by offerings of coca leaves, cigarettes, and alcohol, occupy niches within mine tunnels and are regularly offered these gifts by miners seeking good fortune and protection in their work. This is not a practice relegated to the margins of religious life or regarded as superstition by those who observe it. For many miners in La Rinconada and across the Andean mining world, the tío is as real a spiritual presence as any figure in the Catholic tradition that also forms part of their religious identity, and maintaining a proper relationship with this underground spirit through regular offerings is considered practically important for both safety and productive luck underground. The physical act of mining at La Rinconada takes place within a network of tunnels that extend into the rock beneath and around the glacier, worked both by larger operations with more substantial equipment and infrastructure, and by individual and small group miners working with more basic tools and methods. The underground environment of the mine is, by every measure, an extraordinarily challenging workplace. The same reduced oxygen availability that makes surface life at this altitude demanding becomes even more acute underground, where the combination of high altitude and the consumption of limited oxygen within enclosed tunnel spaces by both workers and any combustion equipment creates working conditions that would be considered unacceptable by occupational health standards in virtually any formally regulated mining environment in the world. Dust, minimal lighting, unstable tunnel structures in some areas, and the constant physical demands of extracting rock at altitude all combine to make the mine itself the most extreme dimension of an already extreme existence. Safety in the mines is a significant and ongoing concern, with accidents occurring at a higher rate than would be acceptable in a formally regulated industrial mining environment. Tunnel collapses, flooding from glacial meltwater infiltrating underground workings, falls, and accidents involving equipment and explosives all represent real risks that miners navigate on every shift. The informal character of many mining operations means that safety standards and practices vary enormously between different operations, and that when accidents do occur, the formal mechanisms for investigation, compensation, and accountability that would exist in a more regulated environment are often absent or ineffective. Mining families understand these risks as part of the fundamental bargain they have accepted in coming to this place, a reality that adds a dimension of physical danger to the economic uncertainty already built into the cachorreo system. The global gold market connects La Rinconada to the broader world economy in ways that most residents experience as an abstract force shaping the practical reality of their daily lives, even if the mechanisms through which it does so are not always fully visible from within the settlement. When gold prices rise on international markets, driven by investor demand for a perceived safe haven asset, by currency fluctuations, by geopolitical uncertainty, or by any number of other factors operating at a global scale, far removed from a Peruvian glacier, the economic activity at La Rinconada intensifies. More migrants arrive, existing mining operations expand, and the settlement grows. When prices fall, the reverse occurs, as the marginal economic viability of mining at such logistically challenging and expensive elevation tips from worthwhile to questionable for some operators, operations contract, some migrants depart, and the settlement temporarily shrinks. This sensitivity to global gold prices means that the fate of tens of thousands of people living on a Peruvian glacier is, in a very direct way, tied to the decisions of investors, central banks, and commodity traders operating in financial markets on the other side of the world, a connection that speaks to the remarkable and sometimes uncomfortable reach of global economic integration, even into the most physically remote and challenging corners of human settlement. Environmental consequences of the mining activity at La Rinconada extend well beyond the immediate settlement, with mercury and other pollutants from the mines and processing operations flowing through waterways that feed into the broader river systems of the region. Research conducted in communities downstream from La Rinconada has documented contamination reaching Lake Titicaca, one of the most significant freshwater lakes on the South American continent, and the cultural and ecological heart of the broader Puno region, raising concerns about the long-term environmental consequences of the mining activity at this extreme elevation for a much wider geographic area. These downstream impacts connect the intimate reality of daily life and labor at La Rinconada to environmental questions of regional and even continental significance, situating this single extreme high-altitude settlement within a much broader story of the environmental cost associated with the global demand for gold. Efforts at environmental remediation and pollution control face significant challenges in the La Rinconada context, beginning with the basic difficulty of enforcing any environmental standard in a settlement that operates largely outside formal regulatory frameworks, and extending through the genuine technical challenges of contamination control at 5,000 meters of altitude in difficult glacial terrain. Various Peruvian government programs and NGO initiatives have worked to address these issues, promoting the use of retorts and other mercury reduction technologies in small-scale gold processing, working with mining operators to adopt better practices, and monitoring contamination levels in water sources. Progress has been real but incremental, with the fundamental drivers of mercury use, specifically its cheapness and effectiveness in small-scale artisanal gold processing, remaining as compelling as ever for individual operators who lack both the capital and the regulatory compulsion to adopt more expensive and complex alternatives. The future of La Rinconada is not easily predicted, dependent as it is on the intersection of global gold prices, Peruvian government policy choices, the availability of alternative economic opportunities in the broader region, environmental sustainability of the existing mining practices, and the ongoing choices of tens of thousands of individual people weighing whether the difficult equation of life at extreme altitude on the promise of mining income remains worthwhile for their particular family circumstances. Some observers and analysts project continued growth as long as gold prices remain at levels that make the extreme logistics of this location economically viable. Others point to the environmental contamination of the glacier itself, with mining activity physically removing and disturbing ice and rock from a glacier system that is itself under additional pressure from broader climate change-driven glacial retreat, as a fundamental long-term constraint on the settlement's future, since the glacier and the gold-bearing rock beneath it are, after all, the physical foundation upon which the entire settlement exists. Climate change adds a particularly significant and somewhat ironic dimension to the future of La Rinconada, specifically because the glacier that the city depends upon is itself vulnerable to the warming temperatures that have already caused measurable retreat in glaciers across the Andean highlands, and indeed across mountain regions worldwide. A settlement that exists because of gold and glacial rock faces the prospect that over a longer time horizon, the physical glacier itself will diminish, changing the hydrology, the physical stability of the terrain, and potentially the accessibility of remaining ore in ways that would have profound implications for the settlement's continued existence. This is not an immediate crisis, but a long-term reality that adds yet another layer of complexity to the already intricate challenge of imagining a sustainable future for this extraordinary place. Despite everything, and the everything here is genuinely considerable, what endures most powerfully as an impression of La Rinconada is not the pollution, or the poverty, or the cold, or the physical danger of the mines, even though all of these are entirely real and entirely serious. What endures is the fundamental human reality of tens of thousands of people building lives, raising children, maintaining communities, celebrating festivals, practicing spiritual traditions, sharing meals, supporting neighbors, and finding meaning and purpose in conditions that by any objective external measure are among the most challenging that any permanently inhabited human settlement on Earth can claim. The miners who descend into those tunnels each morning, the palaqueras who work the tailings in their bright polera skirts, the market vendors who have built small businesses at 5,000 meters of altitude, the teachers who educate children who wake up at an elevation where the air is thin enough to make breathing itself a daily reminder of where they are. All of these people are engaged in the fundamentally human project of making a life work in the particular circumstances they find themselves in, whatever those circumstances happen to be. There is something in La Rinconada that resists easy categorization as simply a place of suffering or desperation, even though genuine suffering and genuine desperation are both present there. It is also a place of aspiration, of community, of cultural continuity, of the enduring Andean heritage that has sustained human life in these extreme landscapes across many centuries. The miners working the cachareo system are not simply victims of an exploitative arrangement, though the arrangement is exploitative. They are also people making a calculated bet, the same kind of bet that has driven gold rush communities throughout human history, that the mountain might deliver enough to justify the price of being there. And for some of them, some